Welcome to this course on international economic law. In this first video, I'm going to present you Chapter 1, the concept of international economic law and the concept of the international economic order. So let's start with what is international economic law. Obviously, it is international, it is economic, and it is law. So what do we mean by this? Well, it is international in the sense that it refers to the law that applies to cross-border transactions. That is to say, any transaction that has some connecting element with two or more legal orders. It is economic in the sense that it refers to economic activity and also in the sense that it applies some insights from economic analysis. And finally, it is law because it deals with the law that governs international economic relations. With regard to this last point, however, we might ask ourselves at what level of legal rules are we concerned with in international economic law? Well, first we have rules governing economic relations between subjects of international law, states and international organizations. So we're talking about international law in its narrow sense. Then we have rules that govern how states treat individuals engaged in cross-border transactions. So these are rules that also regulate of international law, that also regulate how states may act in regulating these cross-border transactions and individuals engaged therein. And finally, we have rules governing private economic transactions. Now, these rules that govern private economic transactions are typically the central topic of private international law. And as such, we're not going to be focusing on them as we're going to look at international economic law in the sense of rules of public international law that govern the economic process, that is, the creation, the protection, the circulation, and redistribution of wealth. Okay, so in international economic law, we have to follow an interdisciplinary approach with a number of disciplines, such as international economics, as we're going to see some of the key insights behind legal rules in international economic law are taken over from international economics. And one of the introductory topics we'll discuss is the so-called law of comparative advantage, as well as the issue of balance of payments. These are two economic concepts that play a key role in international economic law, as we will see. Second, we have constitutional law. As we will see, a lot of the debate around issues of international economic law also has a constitutional dimension. In domestic constitutional law, for instance, in Portugal, the treaty-making power is allocated to Parliament that must ultimately provide its consent to international treaties. But as we will see, a lot of international economic law is really produced within the sphere of intergovernmental cooperation, particularly in the context of international organizations. So the question then is, what is the legitimacy of this international economic law that is devised not with the involvement of parliaments, but with the involvement strictly of governments? So international economic law raises issues regarding the separation of powers within the constitutional legal order of each state. That, as we will see, will also play a key role in understanding the shape and some of the questions raised by international economic law. Then we have international relations, which is a part of political science. International relations also provides us some important insights into how states cooperate and why they cooperate. And so, although it is not a legal discipline, it does also provide valuable insights for any international lawyer. Finally, we have regional and national economic law. International law tends to create a form of superstructure, a framework that regulates only certain aspects of international economic transactions. The remaining aspects are typically dealt with under regional, in the case EU law, for instance, as well as domestic economic law. So, although we will not be focusing on any specific legal regime, we have to take into account this interdisciplinarity between domestic and supranational, in the case of the EU, economic law and international economic law. As we will see, international economic law provides a form of coordination of the exercise of domestic and supranational legal powers. Now, from what we've said so far, international economic law tends to describe more than explain, in the sense that we tend to attribute to international economic law a given number of disciplines: trade, investment, monetary affairs. But this does not really provide us with a guiding principle that connects all these different areas of international economic law. To some extent, that is the role that the concept of an international economic order tends to assume. That is, a normative approach to how we deal, how we regulate economic activities in a global economy. So, the concept of an international economic order is a key also to understand, or to have a broader view of the subject of international economic law, going beyond the mere description of different legal regimes. Professor Petersman has defined international economic order as relating to rules that both regulate the international flow of goods, services, and capital, whilst creating an order that protects the reasonable expectations of economic actors. Now, the idea here is that in order for economic transactions to occur, particularly in a market economy type of global economy, then economic agents need to form these reasonably correct expectations as to how their future transactions will take place, and particularly with regard to the types of government intervention that might interfere with the conduct of such international transactions. Now, note that this is a rational construct, so there is no natural international economic order. So this is simply a construction, a rational construction, a rationalization of different aspects of the de facto economic order that we find. Let me now move on to give you a brief historical perspective over the development of what we might call an international economic order. Now, in the early phase, if we think of antiquity and the medieval eras, these correspond mostly to the development of a spontaneous development of private law. That is not to say that international treaties did not exist covering international economic transactions. They did, some of them going as far back as ancient Egypt and the Hittite kingdom, where there was a treaty between them about 2,000 years before Christ. So I'm not going to consider that. I'm mostly going to focus on the fact that we did not have anything like the current international system that has emerged from the so-called post-Westphalian order. So before that, what we had was mostly the development of the law merchant, the lex mercatoria, the law of traders. Now, these early traders developed their own legal rules on both substantive matters, but also such as bills of sale, letters of exchange, etc. So early banking and financial law is also part of this development. And they also created specific tribunals. Now, the reason for that was that there wasn't any form of international law to regulate these transactions. So merchants developed their own law that could operate, in a sense, in a complementary manner to domestic legal orders, or in some cases, actually replacing it altogether. So that was what allowed traders in, say, Florence or Venice to trade with traders from Bruges or Antwerp or Lisbon or Seville. That was that early form of private law. So when does the state come into play in a significant way, that is in a way that is at least relevant to our course? Well, that tends to coincide with the so-called post-Westphalian order, that is following the Peace of Westphalia, ending the 30-year war. And here what we have is a period where you have a development of public economic law. That is to say, the state starts to take an interest in regulating transactions between economic actors that reside within its borders and those that reside elsewhere. Now, early on, this development coincided with the so-called mercantilist period in the 17th century, where states would try to regulate transactions with foreigners so as to protect the treasury, to protect their ability to hoard gold and other precious material, precious metals. Now, following this period, then sort of goes on. It does coincide with the expansion of colonial trade, but then it is followed by a laissez-faire phase, and that corresponds to the first modern globalization. I'm not going to discuss here the concept of globalization, but you can think of globalization as something that is inherent to any forms of civilization, of human civilization. And if you think that the Roman Empire had trade relations with China, with the Kingdom of China, that shows you that global economic exchanges are not something peculiar to our more recent centuries. But so let's forget about antiquity for a while and let's focus then on this first modern globalization that takes place in the 19th century. Well, this is quite clearly marked by the influence of the ideas proposed by Adam Smith, David Hume, and David Ricardo, particularly following the repeal in the United Kingdom in 1846 of the so-called Corn Laws. These were laws that applied high tariffs on imported grain and food, making it more expensive. By repealing these laws and adopting a free trade, an open trade policy, the United Kingdom heralded a new age of liberalization of international trade. And so the Western world enters into this new period of expansion of international trade, but also of investment. And if we think about industrialization, some of its dimensions, like the building of railways and other major investments in telecommunications, etc., even in the 19th century, a lot of them were actually financed through global consortia of British, French, German, Italian banks, later on also the American banks. And so this is a first period of global expansion of trade and financial relations across the globe. In the financial side, this was a period where we did not typically have a significant role played by the state. There was no, in most countries, there were no modern central banks to speak of. And the gold standard, so gold being the key element in these monetary exchanges, the gold standard became the sort of support or main support for this globalization. It played a key role. Now, this role would be disrupted. This expansion of trade, this gold standard system, would be disrupted by the First World War, and it never did completely recover from it in the interwar period. So World War I obviously disrupted trade. There was a war going on, so trading patterns had to change. The monetary regime, because states had now to face the huge amount of debt incurred in defense and military expenditure, And so they could no longer ensure that their own domestic currencies could be converted to gold or to silver in the case of some countries. And this was followed by the emergence of protectionist policies and discriminatory trade regimes, particularly in the late 1920s, following the Big Depression, and the 1930s. One of probably the most notorious acts in this regard is the so-called Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. And here you can see a picture of both the Senator Hawley and Representative Smoot um, as they were the authors of this Tariff Act. Now, what this Tariff Act did was it substantially increased the tariffs applied by the U.S. on imports from other countries. Now, the idea behind it, as you can see in this picture from the time, was that by increasing tariffs, this would actually make US citizens richer, um, whereas under free trade, they would be unemployed and in misery. Now, reality actually challenged that dramatically. Because what happened was the United States tried to increase obstacles to tariffs through tariffs, obstacles to trade with other countries to limit their imports. But what this actually achieved was to have an identical response from other countries. So other countries raised their tariffs as well. And since they raised their tariffs as well, then US exports actually declined together with imports. So instead of remedying the Great Depression, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act simply increased and made the problems even worse, and this made recovery more difficult in the 1930s. We will see that this policy was abandoned early on in the so-called New Deal by President Franklin Roosevelt, but mostly the new economic order or new international economic order that we find following World War II was one that was conceived and had one of the high points in this conference, the Bretton Woods Conference. The conference took place in July of 1944, so before the war actually ended, and it took place in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the United States. And here, the key delegations were obviously the countries that were not occupied by Nazi Germany, but key among them were clearly the United States and the United Kingdom, as we will see when we talk about the Bretton Woods system in part 2 of our program. Now, the most important lesson that the architects of this new world economic order took from the interwar period was that although free trade is desirable from a global welfare point of view, as proposed by the economists we've seen earlier, Adam Smith, David Hume, and David Ricardo, it is by no means the inevitable result of international economic relations if these take place without a solid framework of multilateral institutions. So the creation of these global multilateral economic institutions was the main development that we see following the World War II. And chief among them, the IMF and the World Bank, both created at the Conference of Bretton Woods, and the International Trade Organization, which, however, would never enter into force. Its treaty, the Havana Charter, was after a while abandoned by the United States, so they did not ratify it, and so it never entered into force. And so we were left with both the IMF and the World Bank, but no equivalent international institution for trade. Now, this was clearly a normative order in the sense that there was a commitment to free trade, to limited economic intervention of states in the international economy. There was a liberal monetary regime based on the now dollar gold standard since following World War II. The hope of other currencies to become convertible into gold was abandoned. It was not a realistic prospect. And so the system became supported on this dollar gold standard that we will deal with in part 2 of our course. Now, this also applied very clear limits on currency devaluation. So countries could no longer use currency devaluations, that is to say, to lower the value of their currency vis-a-vis other currencies as a way to promote their exports and to limit imports to the country. So there were some clear rules in terms of a code of conduct that we will see still form the core of IMF disciplines. Now, obviously, when we talk about this normative order devoted to free trade and limited economic intervention, we're leaving out the so-called Soviet bloc, because obviously the Soviet bloc operated under very different principles. The Soviet bloc operated under a system of under a centralized economy, of centralized control of the economy, with no private property or no private property to meaningfully affect economic relations. And this raised issues that are still relevant today in terms of the need to articulate trade between these very different blocks, between two very different economic and also ideological systems, which may provide us with an interesting parallel to the relation with China's current economic regime. The other major development that also needs to be taken into account is decolonization. Now, this posed a major challenge to the liberal economic order of post World War II, as the balance of power is changed and some of the developing countries start to propose a complete revision, a complete overhauling of the rules sustaining this international economic order. They call it a new international economic order, and in the sense that the accession to independence by these countries requires a different set of rules. The rules that existed at the time were mostly rules developed for and in the interest of developed countries. Now, developing countries said, no, we have different needs. We have needs dealing with our economic and social development. And so we should not be subject to the same rules as apply to already developed economies. So this created a north-south divide in international economic policy and also pressure to change some of the basic rules. And as we're going to see, one of the key areas of contention is the aspect of international economic law as it protects the economic property of aliens against public takings, that is to say, expropriation or nationalization. Now, by the early 1970s, the Bretton Woods monetary system, as it was set up in 1944, collapses. And as we're going to see, this meant that the IMF and the World Bank had to redefine their role. And that will also be part of what we'll cover in part 2 of our course. The collapse of the Soviet bloc, on the other hand, by the end of the 1980s, early 90s, again, there's a change in the global political and economic balance, because by now, there is no viable alternative to a liberal economic order. With the disappearance of the centralized economy, the socialist bloc, the so-called Washington Consensus emerges, and even developing countries that were opposed to this liberal view of international economic relations ultimately end up by adopting the Washington Consensus. Now, the Washington Consensus is a phrase used to express a set of ideas that are proposed both by the IMF and the World Bank, but also by Washington as the capital of the United States, that is to say, by the United States with regard to international economic relations. And this is mostly an agenda for trade liberalization, that is to say, reducing and eliminating obstacles to international trade, privatization, liberalization of economic activities that had been closed, particularly closed to private initiative. And so it forms this package of economic measures that you could call liberal or neoliberal economic agenda. One final development I wanted to note here, obviously many more, is the Marrakesh Treaty. The Marrakesh Treaty of 1994 created the World Trade Organization, which succeeded the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and created a new framework for trade negotiations. The WTO, as we're going to see, shifts the paradigm of international economic law by creating a much more juridicized international economic organization, which has also helped to bring international economic law a lot of attention by scholars. Okay, to complete this chapter and looking forward, do reflect on what functions an international economic order, a normative order, that is to say, an order as to how legal rules should really be developed, and thus also providing us a framework to assess the performance or not of these functions. I would argue that we need to have these three functions into account. First, efficiency. The world's resources are scarce, and so the world, an international economic organization, should be concerned with efficiency, with an efficient allocation of these scarce resources. Now, this does not mean exploiting resources without end. For instance, they have to take into account environmental concerns and also environmental concerns that bring social costs. And this is the so-called internalization of social costs that we will discuss later on. So it might be efficient to use oil now, but that's because the price of oil does not reflect the environmental damage created by using oil. So by adopting measures that internalize these social costs, then the price of oil would necessarily have to increase through taxation, for instance, so that when consumers adopt a decision to use fossil fuels or fuels derived from fossil fuels, then they have to take into account the cost. Fairness is the second pillar. Fairness in the sense that, in the same way that if you think of a national social contract or social compact that provides legitimacy and safeguards distributive justice, thus creating the key elements to bind together a community, a normatively valid international economic order should also strive to reach this goal among nations. So fairness now not within a specific nation, but fairness among nations. And Thomas Frank, as you can see here in this picture, and John Rawls were two key authors in this field. And finally, stability. As Professor Petersman said, economic actors do require stable factual and legal order so that they can make predictable decisions. So an international economic order should also provide this stability function. And okay, that's all for this chapter. And I'll see you in class.